Hello, everybody. Welcome to What Magic Is This? A podcast about magic, the occult, the esoteric, the paranormal, the supernatural, and the weird. My name is Douglas Batchelor, and we have a fantastic show for everybody today. Now, a couple of things have happened recently. One of them happened to be that I released a two-part episode about Hermeticism. What happened in that episode is that towards the end of the second part of that episode, we talked about a very specific book. Even before I had these episodes out, I had a ton of people suggesting to me to cover this book. And even after the episode was released, I was still getting people saying, Doug, you need to talk about this one thing. There's two books that I get constantly asked to cover. It is the one that we will talk about today, and it is another book, which is called The Secret Teachings of All Ages by Manly Palmer Hall. So yes, today we are talking about definitely the most requested book for What Magic Is This podcast. Going to be one book, and to many people, this is the book. And that book itself is called The Kybalion. And my guest for this episode is someone who, more than 5 years ago, wrote an essay, which I will probably very definitely say single-handedly created a reassessment of the Kybalion. And the name of that essay was The Kybalion's New Clothes. And its author is ceremonial magician, blogger, and dare I say it, hacker, Nicholas Chappell. Nick, thank you so much for coming on the show. How are you?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. I'm doing good. How are you today?
Good. It's hot. It's the middle of summer. I have to turn off all the things that keep my apartment a little bit cool just to get a good sound on the microphone, but I'm good to go. Before we jump into any of the questions, Nick, I got to ask, how many times do you think that you've read The Kybalion, cover to cover?
Oh man, cover to cover. I tend not to read a lot of books cover to cover. I tend to take them piecemeal. And I don't know, I have gone through The Kybalion more than several times, which is several times more than, I would like to, but here we are.
I was telling Nick earlier that I probably read The Kybalion about 6 times. So I think between the two of us, maybe if we added it together, there's 10 reads of The Kybalion in total, maybe, give or take.
We are 10 Kybalionists.
Well, there we go. Wonderful. So let's jump in. What is The Kybalion, Nick?
So The Kybalion was written in 1908. It was authored pseudonymously under the name of 3 initiates. The name doesn't have any Greek meaning, but it purports to be a work of Hermetic philosophy. It outlines 7 principles that it claims are fundamental to the laws of the universe and claims to provide a master key to unlock hidden wisdom of the ages, of course. The focus of the Kybalion is largely on self-mastery, specifically mastery of mind.
Okay.
As an early 20th century work that purports to be one of Hermeticism, I encountered this work and went, what? This is not. They keep using this word, Hermeticism. I do not think I do not think it means what they think it means.
It's funny the word Kybalion, because it does sound pretty official in some way.
I mean, there are some speculations as to etymology or where William Walker Atkinson, who is the actual author of the Kybalion, might have derived the name. But ultimately, so in my first job, I worked for a company that had a Greek-sounding name, and it was a small startup. I asked the CEO one day, like, where did you come up with this name? And he said, it sounded Greek. It was 3 syllables, and the domain name wasn't registered. I rather think that Atkinson went for kind of the same thing here.
Right.
It sounds great, but is ultimately bereft of meaning, which is poetic if you think about it.
Right. I hear you. What can you tell us about the story, how the book presents itself as opposed to the reality of the book being produced in the first place? The story that the Kybalion gives you. And then there's the stuff that, unless you get like a special edition, you have to find out for yourself.
So the Kybalion lays out this story that it is the inheritor of the ancient wisdom teachings of Hermes Trismegistus, and it claims that all of its wisdom is derived from the font of Hermeticism. It's very much actually a product of 20th century New Thought and not of classical Hermeticism or even of later Renaissance or Victorian kind of additions onto the Hermetic tradition.
Right.
But William Walker Atkinson really churned out a lot of books. He's a very interesting guy. Churned out a lot of books on New Thought the Kybalion being one of them, under numerous pseudonyms. And ultimately, the Kybalion relates this story of this text called the Kybalion, which I'll call the Kybalion. It refers to itself a great deal in the text and loves nothing more than self-reference. Ultimately, it doesn't really teach anything that it purports to. And this is one of my larger issues with it. It claims that it unlocks this master key of the mysteries, but not only does it not bear an authentic relation to Hermeticism, it doesn't actually teach what it purports to teach either.
Mm-hmm. There's some interesting stuff in there for sure, as far as it keeps referring to itself as something that is like written in stone, almost as important to say the Emerald Tablet of Hermes. And it's just like there's literally no history to it prior to 1908. There's nothing
right.
about the Kybalion.
Which is a very 20th century American way of approaching religion in general. And you see a lot of very ahistorical religious movements cropping up around the early 20th century in America, particularly. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, I think of the Kybalion in the same way that I think of a puppy mill dog. It is a work of exploitation. It's not one of love or authenticity.
Okay. So tell us about the author a little bit. Who was William Walker Atkinson? Because the book says that it was written by the three initiates. William Walker Atkinson's name is not on this text anywhere, but we're pretty much 99% sure that it was this guy. So who was he?
Yeah, I think there's a very strong case to be made that Atkinson was the sole author. If you look at his other works, especially, the Kybalion, as anybody who has read it knows, has extremely idiosyncratic capitalization, turns of phrase, things like that. These appear elsewhere in Atkinson's works. It has his fingerprints all over it. Mm-hmm. Atkinson himself, he was born in Maryland. This was in the latter 19th century, pursued a business career around age 20, became an attorney, got married, had 2 kids, doing the whole thing that you do in life. And his law career burned him out. He described going through a complete physical and mental breakdown, having financial ruin. And then seems to have had this kind of conversion experience almost to New Thought. He was trying to find his own healing, and he found that in the New Thought. Moved to Chicago, which was a nexus for New Thought at the time. Started writing articles in 1889, ultimately ended up publishing magazines and books. He was made an honorary president of the International New Thought Alliance. Oh. They had a number of honorary presidents. So okay. This may not be quite the honor itself.
Right. Okay.
And then he published copiously.
Yeah.
He wrote about 100 books between his New Thought conversion experience and his death in 1932. And most of his works were published pseudonymously. He mostly wrote under the pseudonym Yogi Ramacharaka.
Okay.
His other really popular one was Theron Q. Dumont, but he had a number of them. So,
it's a good name. They're not going to.
It's catchy.
The Rama is not so, actually a little bit iffy, that one, but yeah.
Yeah. I think a white person masquerading as a yogi has worn a little bit thin at this point in our culture.
I think so as well. What was the initial reaction when the Kybalion was produced? Was it a huge hit, or was it a slow burn and eventually people cottoned onto it for it to become pretty much one of the most, if not the most purchased occult book of all time? What was the initial buzz of this book?
I tried to dig into that and tried to find some information about its kind of critical and popular reception, and I wasn't really able to turn anything up, unfortunately. No. I haven't found any information about its early sales or anything like that. What I do know, though, is that the Yogi Publication Society that the Kybalion was published through churned out a lot of works of New Thought between 1904 and 1909 specifically. So when the Kybalion was published in 1908, it was really in its heyday. There was a kind of a big business of publishing in Chicago around New Thought at the time. And so this was kind of hitting when that movement was in full force. So I can't really say whether it's much of a clue to the Kybalion's initial reception. Okay. But the one piece of information that I was able to turn up, thanks to a colleague, Joey, on the Hermetic Agora Discord server,
nice.
He related to me that there was 7 years later in a work called The Riddle of the Sphinx by J. Munsell Chase. He actually incorporates the 7 principles of the Kybalion under the chapter heading Basic Truths Spoken by the Mouth of Divine Hermes. Ironically, and perhaps poetically, the Kybalion was not cited as a source.
Oh, I see.
So very much in keeping with the Kybalion itself, but at least within 7 years of its publication, you have it being quoted in other sources as authoritative for the Hermetic tradition. So that's the greatest clue that I was able to find as to its early reception.
Huh. I read, actually, now that I think about it, the reason that I read it was because it was listed, I believe, in a book by Colin Wilson. And Wilson somehow kind of offhandedly said that, yeah, it was a popular book because Sammy Davis Jr. promulgated it at one point, I believe in the late 60s.
Oh, interesting.
Sammy Davis Jr. himself was like, hey, I read the Kybalion. This was when Sammy was going through his interesting phase. We're just going to call it the interesting phase. But yeah, he talked about how one of the most important books he's ever read was the Kybalion. And so I can't say that is the reason why it is as big as it is right now, but I have a feeling that if Sammy Davis Jr. talked about it at that period of time in the late 60s, that might have been one of the major reasons why a lot of people just started to look it up and it started to become a thing. But it's never been out of print. It's always been around.
Yeah, it's been going continuously since its publication, for better or worse.
For sure. So let's get into a little bit of the book itself. Nick, what is the cosmology as set out in the Kybalion? What does it have to say about the nature of reality?
The cosmology is a hot mess.
Okay.
So it's a very strange cosmology. And this was one of the things that I found most dissonant when I first read the Kybalion with what I'll call classical Hermeticism.
Right.
And I should incorporate a little disclaimer here. Like when I talk about classical Hermeticism or the Hermeticism of late antiquity, it needs to be understood there was no unified kind of agreement on doctrine. You and Sam and Eric covered that amply in your 2-part series on Hermeticism. But I feel like it bears mentioning here. There are a lot of Hermeticisms, early Hermeticisms.
Yes.
That all have kind of commonalities and common features. But yeah, at any rate, the cosmology of the Kybalion, it divides the universe into 3 fundamental planes of existence: the physical, the mental, and the spiritual. But oddly enough, in a way that seems to depart from all of the Platonic or Platonizing flavors of mysticism that I'm familiar with, the Kybalion then states that those divisions are artificial and arbitrary, and that they really lie along the spectrum of manifestation rather than representing kind of discrete or separate planes of being. Each of those 3 planes then get subdivided into 7 subplanes, which seem to be even more arbitrary. It has the mark all over it of, well, we've got to have 7 subdivisions. So the seven minor mental planes, for example, include separate subplanes for mineral, plant, animal, and human mind. And these are interspersed with 3 subplanes for elemental mind, about which nothing substantive is really said. So one gets left with the impression that they're basically placeholders in the schema to make sure that each of the 3 planes has no more or no less than 7 subplanes.
Okay.
But where things like, we're not on that shaky ground right now. I mean, the whole planes being artificial distinctions is weird.
Yeah.
But, other than that, we have kind of this idea of planes that isn't so terribly different from the idea of emanations that you get in Kabbalistic cosmology, or the idea of de-emanationism that you get in kind of a lot of the early Platonism. So,
right.
Where things get really strange is that it has this very odd concept of a teleological evolution. So the idea here is that the human race is continually evolving, and each being reincarnates in progressively more advanced form until we ultimately reach what we understand as godhood and beyond.
Okay.
Which is, again, very much an early 20th century American view of progress, which then gets writ large as evolution and writ even larger as cosmology.
Right.
So you see this cosmology here that the Kybalion operates a lot on the idea of binaries, of discrete states, but as spectra. And so you see here this kind of tendency of the Kybalion to focus more on spectra and on where you fall along a spectrum of being as opposed to this sort of the more what I'll call traditional planar model, right?
Right.
But, you contrast that with an example of Hermetic cosmology in the poem Andres in Corpus Hermeticum 1, explaining where the elements of nature arose from the counsel of God, which having taken in the word and having seen the beautiful cosmos, imitated it, having become a cosmos through its own elements and its progeny of souls. The mind, who is a god, being androgyne and existing as life and light, by speaking gave birth to a second mind, a craftsman who, as god of fire and spirit, created 7 governors. They encompass the sensible world in circles, and their government is called fate. And so you get a very different tone, a very different emphasis on the origin of all of this in the Corpus Hermeticum, in traditional classical Hermeticism, than you get from the Kybalion, which primarily just lays out this framework of a mental universe and the axes in which we move along it, and then says, figure it out.
Right.
Have fun.
One word that gets brought up a ton in the Kybalion is the all, and the idea of the mind as the all. We talked about this a little bit before the microphones were turned on. We started recording, but you said in your essay, The Kybalion's New Clothes, that it is trying to be some form of metaphysical idealism, this idea of the mind being the fundamental source of reality. But when we were talking earlier, you said it's even got that in like a very small degree.
Yeah, the way that the Kybalion uses the word mind is very different from the way that the Hermeticism of late antiquity understood it, and that Gnosticisms understood it. I feel like there's some semantic sleight of hand going on here in the Kybalion, whether intentionally or whether because Atkinson wasn't familiar with the source material. But in order to understand what's going on, we have to look back to the history of early Hermeticism. The word mind, nous, is used extensively in the Hermetic and Gnostic literature, as well as a lot of literature from other Platonic-derived philosophies. So in the sense of idealism, the Kybalion is not remotely unique in positing that all is mind, and that mind is the kind of fundamental building block of the universe, if you will.
Right.
But in the Hermetic literature, God is nous, or at least is the source of nous, which is intimately connected to God. Mind is fundamentally divine. You get lip service to this in the Kybalion, saying that, that all is mind, the universe is mental, talking about the one, the all. But when you pause to look at the ways in which the word mind and mental actually get used in the Kybalion, you see it's being used in very, very different ways than were used in the Hermetica. So in the human being, in Hermeticism, nous is the divine mind. So it's the part of the human mind that's connected to the one.
Right.
It's the part of the mind through which gnosis flows. And just like nous isn't our everyday mind, neither is gnosis our everyday knowledge. So it's an experiential, revelatory, and in Hermeticism, ultimately a salvific form of knowing. And so in classical Hermeticism, it may or may not have been believed that every human being actually had a nous, but it definitely seems that not all human beings were believed to possess access to it. Okay. And so opening up that access to nous, to the divine mind, connecting that part of the human mind, which is divine, to divinity, is a heavy kind of, gets heavy emphasis in a lot of that classical Hermetic literature. Mm-hmm. So then if we look at the Kybalion, we see that it focuses on vastly different ideas, even though it uses some of the same English terminology. It talks endlessly about mind and about the relationship between the human and the divine mind. But when you pull back the curtain and look more closely at how it uses the terms, you see that something very different is going on here. Because in all of the examples that the Kybalion provides, there are no instances of gnosis. There's no divine revelation. There's no focus on ecstatic union with divine mind. Instead, what the Kybalion promotes is self-mastery or kind of a mental continence. And the most charitable technical term that I could find would be enkrateia, which is Greek for kind of self-mastery in the sense of virtuous moderation, right?
Okay.
But mind, from what we can see the Kybalion actually saying about this, is more described as the battleground for our passions and our fears and our kind of sundry maladjustments, right?
Got it.
It's a focus in the Kybalion on the purely rational, as opposed to this idea of a revelatory Gnostic experience, which is fundamentally trans-rational or non-rational in nature.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but does God even get brought up in the Kybalion? Like the divine?
Very little.
Yeah.
just enough to provide the window dressing.
Yeah, just a little sprinkle of God. Whereas if you go through any of the classical Hermetic texts, it's all about God. It's about the connection to the divinity through this kind of divine mind or nous. So very strange. One of the things that everybody knows, who even knows like slightly about the Kybalion, even if they haven't read it, is that there are 7 Hermetic principles. I'm going to go through them real quickly. I have my copy here. I don't have it committed to memory, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately. You never know. We're being very cruel to the Kybalion today. I apologize, everybody. Not really. So we have the principle of mentalism, the principle of correspondence, the principle of vibration, the principle of polarity, the principle of rhythm, the principle of cause and effect, and the principle of gender. You mentioned that Atkinson seemed to want to have this like division of 7 things, but these are very binary distinctions. They always are like, this thing is this way because this opposite of it is this way as well. So what's your take on the 7 Hermetic principles?
Yeah, they are all fairly straightforward, I'll call it. They are simple concepts, almost all of which revolve around this idea of a binary polarity or spectrum. And it can be challenging, I think, to really get at what the Kybalion is attempting to illustrate with those, because there is so much crossover between them. And the explanation is less than clear.
Yeah.
So the principle of polarity is a great example. I mean, you have this idea that everything has its opposite, that all duality is merely a matter of degrees along a spectrum. Mm-hmm. You don't have any binary absolutes such as hot or cold, love or hate. And the mental alchemy that the Kybalion talks about is the idea that one can intentionally shift one's mental polarity away from one emotion or feeling and toward another at will.
Right.
Which ultimately is what the Kybalion is selling. It's self-mastery, and there are these vague hints that by obtaining mastery of one's own mind, you can induce mental states in others. You can cause physical phenomena if you reach the level of proficiency with the mysteries in order to be able to do that.
Yeah.
But ultimately, again, it's talking about how do you manage your feels? How are you managing your own internal states? The idea of rhythm, this idea that everything is in motion along the dimensions spelled out in the law of polarity, gets an additional law tacked onto it. It's a sub-law.
Right.
So you have this law of compensation that is talked about as a sort of conservation of momentum, saying that the degree to which the pendulum swings in one direction is the degree to which it swings back in the other.
Right.
But ultimately, one of the biggest criticisms that I have of the Kybalion, not in reference to its hermetic qualities or lack thereof,
right,
is that it doesn't actually tell you much of anything about how to utilize these principles.
No, it just says that this is the way things are.
Right.
Deal.
Exactly.
Right. Thanks.
Get good, noob. Figure it out.
Yeah. Fuck. It's so strange. You've said, and I have done an episode on this, but you've said that the Kybalion is more New Thought than it is actually Hermetic. Anytime that you talk about Hermeticism, there will be somebody that will say the Kybalion is a Hermetic text. And then you will be able to retort, no, it's more New Thought than anything. How would you go about trying to explain how it's more New Thought than it is Hermetic?
Well, New Thought was fundamentally about this idea that you could achieve this state of mental continence. And it was also called mind cure in the early days, mental science, Christian science. It all kind of grew out of this same New Thought protean form, right?
Which was huge in Chicago. Like it was,
absolutely.
People need to realize this. It's one of my favorite things to research, but Chicago at the time, early 20th century was Chicago, New Thought. It's insane how big it was. It was enormous.
Theosophy also got a good foothold there too.
Yeah.
But so New Thought is all about the idea of health and wellness fundamentally. And that is both bodily health and mental health. The Kybalion addresses it from a more mental health standpoint than, medical science or what have you. It doesn't go the Christian Science route of saying, pray your sickness away. But the fundamental principles of new thought are pervasive throughout the Kybalion. And once you understand what New Thought's thesis is, the idea that by changing the way that you think through the power of positive thinking, you can change your mental states, you can think yourself into prosperity, into happiness, into wellness. You can see it quite clearly in the Kybalion. It's in the same way that when you spend time researching and learning about the history of the Hermetic tradition prior to encountering the Kybalion and then encounter the Kybalion,
right.
It's like, studying a high Renaissance artwork and then looking at an Andy Warhol painting. You go, one of these things does not look like the others.
Right.
But, the Kybalion feels almost like a Mad Lib framework in some ways, into which Atkinson really dropped a bunch of new thought content. And it exists solely to promote the new thought philosophy. That window dressing is just that. It's the candy that you're given to mask the taste of the bitter pill. So, the primary function of the Kybalion as a text, apart from the new thought content, is really to serve as a legitimation mechanism. By pretending antiquity and making a lot of vague and uncited references to the Hermetic masters and to the ancient wisdom, the text provides a veneer of legitimacy for new thought, and anachronistically at the same time reads those new thought teachings into an ancient and well-established mystical philosophy, ultimately hijacking that philosophy for its own ends.
Yeah.
This is one of the areas that I think we speak a lot about cultural appropriation in our time. I think frequently that discourse takes place without a lot of reflection as to what it is to be appropriative. But while the Kybalion, arguing that it is culturally appropriative, might be on thinner ground, but it is definitely a work of appropriation. Okay. It is one which co-opts the texts without authenticity, without standing within that tradition. And as such, once you attain that familiarity, that basic acquaintance with what belongs under the heading of new thought, what is part of this mental science movement, and what falls under the compass of the Hermetic tradition, it really becomes fairly self-explanatory.
Right.
and I don't want to, I know that a lot of people are vehement that the Kybalion is a Hermetic text, and I don't want to crap on anybody who
right.
who holds that opinion. I say that it's obvious, but it is obvious to me, having come from a place of studying these texts, studying the tradition for a long time, and so of course that's my background. So I am biased here,
right.
But
merely by saying it is Hermetic does not necessarily make something Hermetic, and the distinctions of what is Hermetic, if you have listened to my episodes about them, it's such a long period of time. It's not one solid thing, so it's really hard to pin it down. I think that somebody, Eric Purdue, I believe, who's one of the new translators of the 3 books of occult philosophy, he said it really, really well recently when he said that saying that the Kybalion is Hermetic is very much like saying that Mexican food is Mexican food because it has spices in it. It's such a broad, the spices do not make the food Mexican, right? So it's one of those things where just by saying that it's Hermetic doesn't make it Hermetic, and it definitely tilts far more into the category of New Thought, which is how it was composed. It was never composed, I believe, to be a Hermetic document, but it definitely took Hermeticism and was like, I'll take that and I'll just paste it over this one. So very good points, Nick. But the things that we can recognize as maybe being Hermetic, let's drill down on a little bit on these. So the phrase that everybody knows and loves about Hermeticism is the phrase as above, so below, as well as the idea of correspondences. Could you say that, yes, in some way, this is what the Kybalion takes from Hermeticism?
It absolutely is. The greatest irony in my study of the Kybalion is that even the as above, so below, as below, so above quote is not attributed to the Emerald Tablet. It's attributed to the Kybalion.
Right.
So even when using the Hermetic axiom, the Kybalion is quick to claim that glory for itself.
Yeah. Yoink.
But, yeah, exactly. Yeet.
Right.
I think one of the challenges that you really got at is defining what is Hermetic. Because there is more of an emphasis on orthopraxy than orthodoxy in Hermeticism. You have more clusters of things that look similar but aren't necessarily defined in the same way. As we have seen, like the Hermeticism of today looks nothing like the Hermeticism of 2,000 years ago. The Hermeticism of the Renaissance looked nothing like the Hermeticism of 2,000 years ago.
Bingo. Yeah.
And so another challenge that you have to this tradition is that there is constant innovation, and it is a living tradition. And so when a work like the Kybalion comes along that purports to be a Hermetic work, how should we then receive that? If Hermeticism is a tradition that is open to innovation, that is open to changing and to accepting new ideas, and it doesn't just accept new ideas, like it back alley mugs them for ideas. I mean, Pico della Mirandola owes a very large apology to a lot of people for Hermetic Kabbalah.
Yeah.
But that's neither here nor there. So yes, there are definitely some commonalities with Hermeticism. The law of correspondence, the as above, so below, is perhaps the only authentically Hermetic principle that the Kybalion espouses.
Agree. Yeah.
The principle of mentalism, the idea of philosophical idealism, that all is mind, that it shares that in common with Hermeticism as well. That's authentic, although that is also not unique. So there is an entire world of philosophical idealism beyond Hermeticism or the Kybalion. So
right.
The only other point of correspondence that I found was actually a rather interesting one. So in the principle of, or the law of causation, you have almost this analog to the Hermetic idea of astrological fate, except it's not astrological. So
right.
In the principle of causation, let's see here, there is a quote. In the principle of causation, the majority of people, says the Kybalion, are more or less the slaves of heredity, environment, etc., and manifest very little freedom. They are swayed by the opinions, customs, and thoughts of the outside world, and also by their emotions, feelings, moods, etc. The Kybalion is very fond of etceteras, but
yes.
But this is the only area where the Kybalion really narrows in on why though. Why does the Kybalion exist? Why does it purport to teach this mastery? And it's saying that, essentially, wake up, sheeple, which, is common in the occult world in general.
It's somewhat easy to do.
Yes, absolutely. But the way in which it does that is primarily with reference to fate and causation. The word fate is sparingly or rarely used, but this is under the idea of cause and effect. Every effect has a cause. There are no uncaused effects. And as a corollary, there's no such thing as chance. So the text refuses to engage in a discussion of determinism versus free will, because reasons. I will be charitable and not say it was because Atkinson was getting it over his head at that point.
Right.
I am really down on Atkinson, but I own it. So at any rate,
just to veer here, what do you think was going through his mind when he wrote this? Do you think he just did it in like an afternoon? Like I don't want to circle back to the beginning, but.
Well, when somebody churns out 100 books over the course of, you're talking a couple of books a year minimum. Right. And one has to think about the quality that goes into those productions versus the sheer quantity. And and when you do look at his other works and you see kind of the interchangeability of them, some people get on a roll. They have their thought and they're just going to stick with it. And in this case, I think Atkinson found what worked for him and just was incessant about promoting that.
Yeah.
But
I just see him in his underwear with a typewriter, just going at it in his smelly apartment with his. I mean, I don't want to be down on the guy too much, but I just see a near L. Ron Hubbard like character. It's
like the early 20th century occultist equivalent of the 400-pound basement hacker.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I don't have evidence that that's the case. Who knows? He might have gone to like libraries and wrote them there, like Manly Palmer Hall, but. I just see a guy who had some time to spare and he's like, I need to have another book out in 3 months. Like, here you go, world. And here we are now, truthfully we're living in the world of the Kybalion. It's such a monumental text within the occult. Like it gets brought up constantly.
Well, and certainly one doesn't get the impression that a great deal of time was spent in research.
No.
I, having gone through the Kybalion and looked at, does it actually provide citations for any quotes? It actually does, for one, that is by Fuller. It's a scientific principle, has nothing to do with occultism. And so I feel like, a lot of this work was probably turned out pretty quickly, but ultimately what we have to focus on is the text. So we have to make do with what we're given.
Exactly. It's a bit tricky how the Kybalion views the mind. And we talked about it a little bit earlier, but the way that he says mind is so all-encompassing, as if mind just basically equals reality and we shall not question it. But how do you think he used the term mind as to how we use the term mind now?
I mean, I think that's a pretty fair characterization of the New Thought in general. This idea that if you change your thinking, then you can change your reality. And ultimately, I think there's a lot less difference in the way that we use mind now versus the way that the Kybalion used it in vernacular English versus the kind of the technical nature of mind as nous in the Hermetica. But, I think ultimately you really have to look at how the word is being used.
Yeah.
Words are tricky things. And in this case, I think particularly when you're talking about 2,000 years of history, when you're talking about differences in culture, differences in translation, and a heavily mystified past, it ends up being very easy to exploit that, to insinuate into this tradition. But, I'd like to go back to kind of talking a bit more about what makes something authentically Hermetic or not.
Yeah.
What makes the Kybalion inauthentically Hermetic, while you see something like the Golden Dawn, for example, that is like nothing that came before it, in Hermeticism, but these days is accepted as just being a part of this Hermetic thing, right?
Yeah, right.
So why is what they did different? Why can we have innovation, and why is the innovation or kind of the addition to the Hermetic tradition that the Kybalion offers not one that I'm inclined to accept? Really, when I'm looking at what makes a Hermetic text Hermetic, I'm looking at consonance between the philosophy of the text and the original Corpus Hermeticum, or at least some of the outgrowths, right, from the Renaissance or the Victorian era. I'm looking for consonance of practice, of mythos, and what I'm looking for is a connection of the text to prior Hermetic sources.
Right.
This is a big one, because when you stand in a tradition, you have almost this intellectual chain of custody in a way. And the Kybalion attempts to short circuit that by quoting the Kybalion. But ultimately, it doesn't cite any sources. All of the references that it makes to Hermetic teachings or the Hermetic masters of old are paraphrastic. They are uncited. There are no Hermetic sources cited whatsoever, which is, if you look at the evolution of Hermeticism over 2,000 years, the way that this was done, the way that the tradition was built upon and lived in and added to, was by building on what had come before, by citing those sources, by drawing upon authorities, by drawing upon previous knowledge. And so the Kybalion fails to do that. And not only that, but it tries to have its cake and eat it too. When you are trying to stand within a tradition, you can either be a part of that authentic tradition with what is already there, or you can innovate upon that tradition. You can maybe do both, but that becomes exceedingly tricky. And the Kybalion explicitly claims to be an ancient text, which means that it has a burden of proof. It needs to be able to stand within that tradition, connect to it, and connect the dots to what came before it and to what comes after it. And ultimately, a lot of the ideas in the Kybalion, the idea of like the law of vibration, something that has been made extensive use of by the Golden Dawn. You have this idea of vibrating God names, and that is something that has been accepted. Like this idea of vibration, it's been at least kind of peripherally accepted as a legit part of the wider umbrella of Hermeticism.
Yeah.
But in the case of the Kybalion, it's drawing upon this idea of vibration that originated in the 17th century with David Hartley. And so it is definitely not a product of antiquity. you look at the ways that it attempts to claim it is Hermetic, and those all rely upon a connection to an ancient and authentic source. And at the end of the day, the Kybalion fails to deliver when it comes to putting up its sources.
Right. Yeah. It's one of those things. I want people to think of this in their mind of a 2,000-year party, and everything's going good, everything's fine. And then somebody just shows up to that party with a name tag that says, I'm here, I'm welcome to be in the Hermetic Club. And everybody just kind of, music stops, everybody takes a look and says, sorry, who are you? And it's like, I'm part of this party. I'm one of the gang. And I said, you're not. And they just basically say, look, I've got the name tag. I've got the name tag. It says I'm a Hermetic. He said, that's written in crayon. It's a forgery. It's not even a very good forgery. But and they say, well, it's got the word Hermetic on it. So I'm welcome to have here. And then it heads over to the hors d'oeuvre table and eats everything. And next thing you know, that's the only thing that they remember about that party is when that guy showed up.
Would you say then that it's fair to call the Kybalion a chemical wedding crasher?
I bingo, absolutely. For sure. So even if we can wipe away many of the claims that the Kybalion is Hermetic, it also claims to have knowledge from ancient Egypt and Greece. I have heard other people that really promulgate the Kybalion that it has deep ancient truths. What's your take on this? Does it really?
No. Ancient truth can be found everywhere. That's just the way it is. You have these seeds of ideas that get sown and germinate and, are with us and kind of branch off into different tributaries of ideas throughout the course of our intellectual history, right?
Right.
But for the Kybalion, again, it is definitely a 20th century American work. And when you learn to recognize the hallmarks of that, the ahistoricity of it, the narrative of progress, you have at this time, kind of with the 19th, early 20th century, especially this idea of, or you have this tension, I think, between magic and an increasingly materialistic scientific world. And consequently, you see a lot of psychologization of magic. The Golden Dawn certainly kind of started down that path as well. And you see in the Kybalion a much more narrow kind of psychologized view of occultism.
Right.
If you look back to the Greek magical papyri, the technical documents of what Hermetic magic looked like back in antiquity, then you see a very different picture of things. Yeah. It relies on the gods, the spirits, on speech. And this is one of the interesting things, I think, about the Kybalion is that Hermeticism has always been about the power of speech and the word, primarily, the logos. In the Kybalion, it's all about mind. It's all about thinking. And so the idea of writing or speech that would be essential for something in the PGM is completely absent from the Kybalion.
It's non-existent.
Right, because the battleground is mind.
Yeah.
That is where the battle is fought in the New Thought. You can say that the Kybalion might be an inheritor of ancient wisdom in the sense that a broken clock is right twice a day. but beyond that, it really is a very 20th century American work.
Yeah. I'm obsessed with ancient Egypt. I'm obsessed with ancient Greece, more so ancient Egypt. We don't have a ton of documentation, but we have a sufficient amount to be able to see what kind of worldview and what kind of a reality that they lived in. If you were to, even with the moniker that this is a modernization of ancient Egyptian ideas, if you were to try and talk to ancient Egyptians with the 7 principles and the 3 planes, they would have no fucking clue what you're talking about. They would think that you are insane. They'd feed you to the gators or crocodiles. But it's one of those things that this whole idea, particularly the ancient Egyptian thing that a lot of people say, and which is promulgated, I've used that word a lot this show, but promulgated by people that are fans of the Kybalion, is that it's ancient Egyptian wisdom. It is so far away from ancient Egyptian wisdom. It's scary in some respect. And it's really harmful, I think, to think that what you're talking about when you quote the Kybalion is ancient Egyptian. It's not in any way, shape, or form. Please stop saying that. It is, as Nick says, it is a fairly modern text. It's early 20th century text. So I don't know if you can speak to that at all. I just don't think that if you were to get an ancient Egyptian, time travel, and start reading a couple of passages, they would have no idea what you were saying.
I mean, in fairness, that would probably be true of, Renaissance or Victorian or
True.
modern day Hermeticists as well. The Kybalion has gotten a free pass, I think, a lot over the years. And we've seen that it's easy to claim a truth and a lot harder to refute it. I mean, We went through 4 years of that with Trump here. Yeah. we saw that every day. It's easy. It's easy to tell lies. It's a lot harder to tear them down. But I think in general, I love the occult community. I love a culture, but I think that the occult and esoteric community in general tends to be uncritical about its sources. Yeah. I think that was especially true back when the Kybalion was first published. I think it's only been with the modern kind of advent of the internet and widespread sources, a lot of books that are widely available in print. We have unparalleled access now to texts and to sources that people mere decades ago didn't. And so I think that the tide is changing. You definitely have some kind of muddy waters with authentic Hermeticism as far as there is some overlap. There is some superficial resemblance. And the way in which Hermeticism is a multifarious thing makes it easy to hijack. If you were going to intentionally try to insinuate yourself into a tradition in order to pretend a veneer of authenticity, Hermeticism is almost ready built for it. Right. Because it is very open and it looks very different from person to person. But, when you see the vastly different areas of concern between the Kybalion and the Corpus Hermeticum, when you see the different emphasis on how knowledge is to be received and towards what ends it should be applied and the nature of being, it falls apart quickly.
Yeah, it certainly does. A lot has happened with this advent of the internet, and we're actually able to look upon these old texts with somewhat new eyes. I find even in definitive editions of the Kybalion, the people that put them out, they will do a good job, particularly, I believe it was Philip de Slip. They do a good job of putting the story of William Atkinson in there. They have a bit of the press history of it. But then they will continue to say that, and this passage is very clearly from the Corpus Hermeticum. Why is it that you think that the Kybalion gets a free ticket to Hermetic land? Like, why does this one seem to be the one that people are just like, yeah, sure. Well, is it just because it sells well? If you put your name on it, it makes some cash? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have asked myself this question a lot and looked into the question of why does the Kybalion seem to have this enduring popularity, and why has it been received in the way that it has? And there are a few answers that I keep coming back to. The first is that the Corpus Hermeticum isn't exactly approachable. No. It is a poetic work. It makes the Bible look like easy reading. For those of us who are weird, that it can be our idea of a fun time, but it's not necessarily approachable. It's not necessarily accessible. And the Kybalion may not offer a great deal of depth, and it may not deliver on the claims that it presents, but one thing it is approachable. And so, I rarely even see editions of the Corpus Hermeticum in bookstores. It's not something that's fairly popular. Meanwhile, right now, the Kybalion is number 4, I think, in Amazon in the occult texts, like Occult Books category.
Always top 5. Yeah.
So, it's had this enduring popularity. And I think a lot of that is because it is accessible. It is approachable. And when your options when you hear about this thing called Hermeticism, and when you're wanting to understand what that is, and you start looking into it, your avenues for that are still at this point largely academic texts, the Corpus Hermeticum, and the Kybalion, as far as things that purport to be an introduction to Hermeticism in general, right? Not a particular flavor thereof or a particular kind of sub-discipline, right? So I think its approachability has kept it popular over the years. And again, like, Hermeticism is a living tradition. It's undergone a lot of changes over the millennia of its existence, and as such, it's very hospitable to syncretic additions. So given that the Kybalion very intentionally insinuated itself into that tradition, it's more difficult to extricate.
Right.
So, I think the status quo for a long time has been that this text is claimed to be a part of the Hermetic tradition, and that's largely gone unchallenged. So,
until you came along, Nick.
I do what I can. Sometimes you just need to get angry enough at something and irritated enough to write a research paper.
How much hate mail did you get for that essay?
None, actually.
What? Really? Jeez. Well, it is very, very well laid out, and it's one of those things. All right, no, I guess so. But it's one of those things. Probably people reading this, like, I'm just going to ignore that. It makes too good of a point.
I'm sure I'll get hate mail for it at some point, but thus far I've been extraordinarily fortunate.
Okay, well, jeez, man, I get hate mail for every episode I put out. I don't understand why. Anyways. You don't want hate mail.
One thing too with the Kybalion as well, I think you see such cross-pollination with New Age culture. You have the book The Secret, which is basically the Kybalion repackaged for modern audiences. That cross-pollination has ensured that the concepts that the Kybalion talks about are already familiar to a lot of readers. Right. So people who aren't aware that the type of thought that the Kybalion is promoting is a direct relation to things like Christian Science or the Faith and Prosperity movement. People who have encountered these ideas in our culture and they seem familiar. I think a lot of people, when they pick up the Kybalion, they have had some kind of background encounter with these ideas before. And I think for a lot of people, they read through it and go, okay, this makes sense. This seems legit. And I think that for those who may be of a more mystical bent than a magical mindset, for those people who are looking more for a difference in perspective, that may be more beneficial.
Yeah.
For people who are looking to take more direct action in their fate, who are looking to transform reality around themselves, their own and the reality around them, I think that when you start looking for insight in the Kybalion into how to actually apply the teachings that it gives, that's where I think things really come up dry.
Yeah. I've used this analogy before, but it's a gun without a trigger. It looks nice, it looks sexy, you want to hold it, but you can't at any point in the book, you can't actually apply it. There's really nothing practical to it, right?
Well, at least the safety is on.
Yeah. It gives you all of this information and it just goes, here you go. Off into occult land with you. You're an expert now. And then you show up into any place. I mean, we talked about the Hermetic Agora Discord server. When people show up there and say that I'm here because of the Kybalion, it's like not a block, but you immediately get the by the way, they have a bot set up there. It's like, by the way, here are the things you need to read. That's a strange one. I want to talk particularly about a somewhat controversial part of the Kybalion, and that is one of the 7 Hermetic principles, which is the principle of gender. Why is this one such a clusterfuck these days?
Yeah, I mean, I think this reflects a larger transformation in our culture around gender and understandings of gender. The principle of gender takes reproductive biology and turns it into this abstract symbolic concept, which it claims is a fundamental law of the universe. And that isn't anything new. I mean, you see that in a lot of, I think, especially 19th, early 20th century work. But that view of gender it's not only based on an anthropocentric view of reproduction, but a naive one at that. And, today we live in a society where heterosexuality can't be assumed anymore, where we recognize the distinction between gender and biological sex in very different ways than we did 100 years ago, where genderqueer is a word that's entered our cultural vernacular. And I think consequently, we're seeing a lot of those fundamental assumptions breaking down that underlie something like the principle of gender. Sam Block did a great 2-part post on his Polyphonies blog about gender in classical Hermeticism, and has demonstrated very effectively that it only enters the equation in the Corpus Hermeticum when it's talking about human reproduction. So in terms of the relationship of gender to traditional classical Hermeticism in antiquity, I can't point out a resource any better than that. But the idea of spiritual gender doesn't exist within those Hermetic texts. So you can see echoes of those ideas in latter-day Hermetic authors like Dion Fortune, for example. But times change and ideas change with them. I think the Kybalion is showing its age in that respect, which for a text claiming to be a work of timeless wisdom is a difficult state of affairs to be in.
Yeah. It just seems like one of those ones that was tacked on. Like, I can get correspondence and stuff. I can get the mentalism stuff. And then it's just like, and I'm going to talk about gender because it's another binary. At least it was then. It was like, you could have skipped. There's plenty of other things to throw in there, Atkinson. But yeah, that's the one where if you ever go onto any kind of a message board, the people trying to big up that particular Hermetic principle, that's where things really start to break down. And you can see like, you had these ideas before you even picked up the Kybalion, and it's not serving you well. I'll just say that. But
I think the Kybalion presents an interesting, almost a Rorschach test in a way. I mean, in the same way that it seems like a bit of a Mad Lib for Atkinson to fill in new thought details. Yeah. I think what people take from it also ends up saying more about that individual than it does about the Kybalion.
Bingo. Yeah, very much so. I mean, I know people that really love the Kybalion, and it's one of those things. I don't want this to come off and when everybody listens to it, it's just, I get it, but maybe what Sam Block said during the two-parters, you can do a little bit better than the Kybalion. That's basically all I'll say. I got to ask you though, Nick, is there anything of value to take from the Kybalion? Is there any part that you do like?
I'll be perfectly honest. I am just not a fan of the text. There really aren't any parts of it that I actually like. But to be honest, I am harsh on the Kybalion. I am harsh on Atkinson. But I don't discount that there are those out there who find value in it. I just don't fundamentally relate to that experience. Once you take away once you pull back the curtain, the Kybalion isn't really unique. Atkinson's other works are strikingly similar. And apart from being inauthentic, the Kybalion also just strikes me as ineffective. Over on the Hermetic Agora, Sam Block had a great kind of hot take on the Kybalion, which is basically that what the Kybalion says can be summed up as think different. And, think different was a great marketing campaign. I love that marketing campaign. But, if I'm trying to service a MacBook, if I'm trying to figure out how to unfuck my hardware, then I can watch all of the advertising campaigns in the world and it's not going to make a bit of difference to me. So at the end of the day, that's a bit how I feel with the Kybalion. You're told to think different. You aren't really given a lot of parameters for how to apply this. And so I feel like it's a lot of sound and fury signifying very little.
Right. It was written by a salesman. That was it. Like he apparently had the gift of the gab, and he definitely had that strange experience, but he still retained his salesmanship, right? It's a product of salesmanship. I hate to say it, everybody. Why do you think that something like the Kybalion has lasted for as long as it has? This is just that what you had said earlier, that it's very easily approachable. It reads somewhat easily. There's simple language, but somewhat big-ish ideas.
I think that's a large part of it. And I'm not a great judge of popularity by any means. I couldn't chart the wax and wane in the Kybalion's popularity if I tried. But the one trend that I do see is that every time the Kybalion gets brought up on the internet these days, someone generally comments to point out that it's not a Hermetic text.
Oh, that's good.
At least in the discussions that I've seen. And so the critique of the Kybalion is gaining traction in a culture. The fact of the matter is the book is on the shelves. The critique is not. And, critique always is slow to catch up. So I think in some respects that kind of the dissemination of that critique and the context that underlies the actual text is almost a separate question from the popularity of the Kybalion itself. Because if the book continues to be popular, but so does the critique, you still end up with a situation in which you have a wider number of people who know about the actual sourcing, the actual background behind that book. And if people still find value in it, nonetheless, so be it.
Yeah, I think so. There has been a lot of kickback, and I do remember a period of time when particularly in we're talking early aughts, trying to get any glimmer of knowledge from somewhat nascent internet, that, yeah, somebody mentions Hermeticism, first thing that comes up is Kybalion. That's not happening anymore. And so it's always good to see. Somebody will later on very further down will be like, oh, and by the way, read the Kybalion. And then nowadays people are starting to get a dog pile on them. It's not Hermetic. So it is happening, but I think you're right. The critique is taking its time. Again, the Kybalion has at least 100 years on us, or on those that do have a critical view of the Kybalion. So we'll see what happens with it. Do you think that reading into something like metaphysical idealism would basically give people everything they'd need to know without the kind of faux Hermetic dressing that the Kybalion has? And can you think of a book that basically does the same thing as the Kybalion without all the other shit?
Honestly, if you want to do what the Kybalion purports to do without all of the other shit, don't look into philosophical idealism, look into clinical psychology. Okay. I mean, the fact of the matter is that the kind of mental continence, the kind of changing your thoughts, changing your emotional states that the Kybalion purports to teach. Personally, my take on it is that those ends are all better achieved with evidence-informed clinical psychology.
Yeah.
That said, I have tried to think of a really good replacement, as it were, for the Kybalion, and there really aren't a lot of great options that I've encountered. If somebody has any suggestions, I would love to hear them. But unfortunately, I think as a digestible intro to Hermetic philosophy, that's something that there's still a gap for, I think, in the esoteric community.
Yeah, there's no Hermeticism for dummies yet.
No, you see a lot of academic texts about the history of Hermeticism. You see a lot
expensive academic texts.
Yes, and you see a lot of like Magic 101 kind of things. But when it comes to what Hermeticism actually is, I at least haven't seen a great intro to it. So if there's one out there, please give me a heads up. I would love to find it.
I think that's pretty good advice, though, is to look to actual psychology, like clinical psychology. Psychology is one of those things where if you ask somebody to explain it, it's like somebody trying to explain magic. It's very hard to pin down, but there is a bit of a pedigree there. So I definitely would agree with you in some sense. I find that if the idea of you want to believe that consciousness is fundamental to reality, grab a Bernardo Kastrup book. He's very good at going through metaphysical idealism. He's got a book called Why Materialism is Baloney. Read that. It's very easy to read. It is quite wonderful. And Bernardo is an incredibly smart man. But again, as Nick said, the book itself is kind of pseudo-idealism. So that's not the whole thing. But that's about as close as I've been able to come to, is if you can find Bernardo Kastrup's books, they're very good. And if you like the idea that it's all mind, that's about as great as you're going to get these days. Some people, though, will say this, and they'll know all of the critiques, Nick, and they'll say, so what? I don't care. I don't care if it isn't what it says it is. I don't care that it's not Hermetic. I still find the Kybalion eminently useful in my life and how I understand the world. Is there anything wrong with that? I don't really know if there is.
Not at all. Not at all. I think magic and esotericism are always about each individual's path. So, every person has to find their own way. Like the issue that I took with the Kybalion, I find that a lot of critiques of Christian Science and the faith and prosperity movement apply to the Kybalion as well. I have some issues with some of the implications of the philosophy, but overall, my issue was with the text claiming an authentic Hermetic origin, not with what the text promotes itself necessarily. So yeah, as long as you just know that it's not an authentically Hermetic text, so people on the internet won't yell at you about it, you're fine.
I got to ask, Nick, are we just elitist assholes? Or is it just like those of us that rail against the Kybalion, are we just sticks in the mud? Do we have a problem? Is there something wrong with us, Nick? I got to ask.
I really try not to be an elitist asshole.
Okay.
And I come from a Golden Dawn background, so I'm well familiar with there are a lot of elitist assholes in the occult community, especially in my neck of it. So, I always try and not be that.
Right.
And, I have strong opinions about the hermeticness of the Kybalion and about some of the ideas that it affords. But, I take any other author to task just as much. And there's a lot to take to task here. But that's neither here nor there. I mean, that is just what the text is. I don't know. I like to think that I'm not an elitist asshole, but if my position on the Kybalion makes me an elitist asshole, then I guess I will have to live with that.
Yeah, I hear you. Do you ever see the Kybalion's influence waning, or will it continue to be as popular as it ever was?
I'm not a prognosticator. I could do some divination around that or something, but I don't know. I mean, I think my personal sense of it is that as you get farther away from the early 20th century, and I think particularly given the changes in our culture, given the directions in which things have been moving, I guess if I had to take a guess, I would say that the idiosyncrasies of the Kybalion that make it show its age are just going to get more long in the tooth. And I think that at some point there will probably be a falling off of popularity, but who knows when and if that will come.
Yeah, I don't think it will. I think that, as mentioned in the Hermeticism Part 2 episode, I think it is a book that is symptomatic of a culture that is very spiritually distanced right now. And I see that getting more and more of a currency as we drift further and further away from things like magic, things like having an experience-based epistemology with magic itself. I do think that probably the Kybalion is just going to continue being one of those texts that is still going to be discovered by generations and generations. It's like, oh, you have to read this thing. But I do think that is indicative of the mess that we're in right now. I'll just say that. Nick, would you suggest people read the Kybalion at least once? And if so, after hearing everything that we've gone through today, what should they keep in mind as they go through it?
I wouldn't necessarily suggest that anyone read the Kybalion, but I would suggest that people familiarize themselves with it, or at least look at it, if only because understanding the Kybalion's inauthenticity helps you to be more critical and discriminating when it comes to the sources that you draw from.
Right.
What I would recommend is that before anyone reads the Kybalion, they should read at least a little bit of the Corpus Hermeticum first, just to get a taste of it, to get the feel for it. You compare the prayer of Hermes in Corpus Hermeticum 1, you whom we address in silence, the unspeakable, the unsayable, accept pure speech offerings from a heart and soul that reach up to you. And then you go to the Kybalion and it's completely different. I think having that experience is a valuable one. So once you encounter the poetry and beauty of genuine Hermetic philosophy, I think it becomes easy to see that the Kybalion is an imitation and it doesn't match the tone or the intent of the authentic tradition. While the Kybalion might be forgiven for a multitude of sins, ultimately I think that mismatch of tone and intent to me is what's most damning to it in the final analysis. I mean, it's less individual principles, it's less the specifics of how it goes about it, or even the fact that it doesn't quote sources, but it's the complete mismatch of tone and intent.
Yeah, I hear you.
At the end of the day, I think I would rather stick with, oh, what a great miracle is man, O Asclepius, than the vision of the cosmos that's purported by the Kybalion.
I would definitely agree with that. And have we missed anything? I think we've covered this text probably better than any other podcast I've ever heard about the Kybalion. I think we nailed it. Have we walked over anything? Have we negated anything about the Kybalion, Nick?
I think we've turned over all of the major stones.
Wonderful. Just to go on this idea that when people do talk about the Kybalion is that they will say it all is mind, or it's all in the mind. And this to me may be one of those things where, yeah, do a little bit of research on idealism if this kind of idea is interesting to you. Idealism may very well be the way that the world functions. We are far from understanding it, or even maybe we'll not understand it at all, but there's better ways of seeing the implications of an idealist model of reality than one that is dressed up in a binary pseudo-mysticism written by a salesman. There's few answers or questions in the Kybalion at all. And at best, it is a wonderfully constructed product, plain and simple. It is a snapshot we keep reliving of just how we have been somewhat mystically and spiritually in decline since the 19th century. At its worst, it is a cul-de-sac. And sure, you can say all is mine, whatever, it's fine. But there's more to these ideas than anything that can be found in this book, which is the fortune cookie version of idealism, if that at all. So allow yourself to look a little bit further than the Kybalion lets you. Nick, thank you so much for being on the show and for your essays. Where can people find find your work? What are you getting up to? What's happening next for Nicholas Chappelle?
You can find my blog at hermeticulture.org. I hang out over on the Hermetic Agora Discord server, so you can always find me there. And right now I'm toying around with releasing a second Kybalion paper to cover some of the gaps that I didn't cover in my first one. So nice. No time frame for that, but stay tuned.
Wonderful. You thinking of writing any books? You should write the counter to the Kybalion book. I think it would be pretty successful. I'd buy it.
Don't know about any books in my future, but no. But blogging at least, that's my speed.
I do want to say that Nicholas has a fantastic blog. It's yourself and
Spencer M. Graves, which is actually just my pseudonym. So,
isn't that?
So funny thing, like I actually ended up gaining popularity because of this Kybalion article under my real name. I had come up with a pseudonym to write under, and then I'm just like, to hell with it. Really? So that was an idea that didn't really take off on my end.
For sure. There was a really great blog entry you had on there about the Golden Dawn and how you who have come from a background of the Golden Dawn and your disenchantment with the Golden Dawn. I would suggest everybody read that, especially if the Golden Dawn does interest you. So I can't wait for more things on hermiculture. I think it's really wonderful work that you have up there, Nick.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for having me on today. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.
I will have a link to Nick's blog, Hermiculture, as well as a link to the essay that started this whole ball rolling, the Kybalion's New Clothes, in the show notes at whatmagicisthis.com. Also there, you will be able to find a link to my Twitter account, my Instagram account, as well as my Facebook account. I'm somewhat active on Twitter. The other two, I'll pop in every once in a while. But if you reach out to me either through those social media sites or through the email at whatmagicisthis.com, I will respond to you. So give her. If you've enjoyed the show, please tell a friend, and perhaps they'll tell a friend, and then they'll tell a friend, and that's how this whole word of mouth thing gets going. And truthfully, I think that it is a fantastic thing. I just had somebody the other day tell me, I love your show. I've shared it with all my friends, so keep that going, because the more people that find the show, the better. Also, if you enjoy the show, please leave a review on either iTunes or Stitcher or any place that you can. Star clicking is all well and good, the 1 to 5 stars. Hopefully you click the 5-star one, right? But if you want to write a few words about me, saying how much you love the show and appreciate the work that I do on my show, please do that. People do read those reviews, and a lot of times they decide whether or not they want to listen to the show based on those reviews. So if you can write a few words about my podcast, that would be greatly appreciated. Let's say that you really love the work that I do on What Magic Is This, and you feel like you want to support. Well, I have a Patreon account. That can be found at patreon.com/whatmagicisthis, or head to whatmagicisthis.com and click any one of the Patreon links there. They're all over the place. It's only $7 a month, and there's exclusive material that I have up there. It's not just, I'm going to have an extended interview with the guest. I do full shows on that Patreon account of things that I find interesting. And guess what? You, the patrons, get to pick what I talk about that month. Last month, I did an episode about pirates and magic, or a very specific story involving pseudo-pirates and a bit of witchcraft that occurred on one of their expeditions. My favorite content that I put out is in that Patreon. Truthfully, I'm not just saying that to try and get people to sign up, but if you think that I'm a pretty interesting guy and you like my takes on magic, the stuff I love is on the Patreon. That's where I get to flex my muscle. That's where I get to be really creative with the things that I want to release. If you can't get enough of the stuff that I do on the regular podcast, you gotta sign up for the Patreon. Again, $7 a month. And besides the extra material, you get access to message me at any time on either the Patreon itself or through a Discord server that is only for patrons of Patreon. It's a wonderful community that we have going there. It's some of the greatest people ever, and so many people's questions get asked there. I had somebody say, hey man, I need a good occult community. And I said, truthfully, I don't want to try and pitch you, but I think that the community we have over on the What Magic Is This Discord is by far the best. We have some of my former guests that are regular, frequent users of the Discord. It is a wonderful thing, but you can only get access to that Discord and only get access to that exclusive material if you sign up for the Patreon. So patreon.com/whatmagicisthis. If you do not like the whole sending $7 a month thing, that's not really what you're going after, but you still want to support the show, I have PayPal me links all over my website. Click any one of those and you can donate $5, $10, $20, $2,000, $10 million. I am not picky. It all goes back into keeping this podcast running for hosting both the website and the podcast, as well as buying books and materials that I need to have to produce my show. All of the PayPal me stuff, it literally goes back into making What Magic Is This as magical as it actually is. But you do not get access to any of the exclusive material if you do the PayPal stuff. That comes with being a Patreon subscriber. So best thing you can do, patreon.com/whatmagicisthis. But all of those things, Twitter account, show notes, Patreon, PayPal, all of that can be found at whatmagicisthis.com. Head there for the good shit. That's the show, everybody. And hopefully at some point, I'm sure I'm going to try and get you back on the show, Nick, and it'd be wonderful if you could join us again. This has been ridiculous. I've learned a lot, and hopefully everybody else has as well. So I hope if I asked you to come back on the show, you would.
It would be my absolute pleasure.
Fantastic. So that's the show, everybody. I hope we've really uncovered a little bit more about the Kybalion than you were expecting, at least. And if you're a fan of the Kybalion, I just want to say,
I'm sorry.
No, you know what? I'm not even sorry. I'm not.
And you're the Canadian one.
Yeah, I know. You know what? Figure it out. We have an expression up here. Figure it out. And so that's all I'll say. The Kybalion, figure it out for yourself. So with that, I want you all to join me next time. We'll go through some of this strange, weird, wonderful stuff that we call magic and the occult. Until then, I want you all to stay healthy, stay hopeful, and stay luminous. We'll talk to you soon, everybody. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.